at the end of the program. We really appreciate your feedback, so please make sure you have one, and if you don't, we have some at the back, so you can just grab one, or you can just get one from me. So we'll be getting those at the end. And now I am honored to introduce to you our guest speaker, who will be talking about the amphibian extinction crisis, current threats facing amphibian populations, and what you can do about it. And now, welcome Michael Starkey from Save the Frogs.
Hi, everyone. First of all, can you all hear me in the back? Yes, good, because I don't like microphones, and I move around too much, so this is good. First of all, I'd just like to thank you all for coming to my talk today. And how many of you are concerned with what's going on with amphibians? Raise your hand. A few of you, okay. How many of you really like frogs? Okay. And how many are here for extra credit? Okay, well that's interesting, because I thought there'd be a lot more. Anyone late, I'm going to assume that they're here for extra credit. So to get started, my name is Michael Starkey, and a little introduction about myself and my background. For the last 7 years, I've been working as a biologist, working with mostly reptile amphibians and other animals that people don't like. I worked 4 years studying a snake in California called the giant garter snake, the San Francisco garter snake, rattlesnakes, California tiger salamanders, red-legged frogs, and also bats. I spent a good time working with bats in Central America. And so a lot of these animals people don't understand, they assume things about, and I'm going to paint a picture of some animals that I tend to like, the frogs and amphibians as well, and how maybe you may not have thought about them in a certain way. And also, it was through my travels through Central America that I saw some very alarming things that happen with amphibians, and I'll share that with you as well today. And so there's a little bit of audience participation in this presentation, but if you have a question, please just hold it to the end, and I'll make sure to give time at the end to answer it. And also, I have a table out front that I'll answer any questions if you don't want to ask them in the audience setting. So to begin, we have to go back to school. What's an amphibian? Well, an amphibian is a type of animal that lives actually 2 lives. It's actually its word, it's Greek. Amphibian is Greek for 2 lives. Because where do you find most amphibians? Frogs. Well, they usually are in ponds, they're tadpoles, and they change and start life on land. And its link to water is really important to understand about amphibians, because really dry out or desiccating is the amphibian's worst nightmare. And amphibians are some of the oldest land vertebrates. They've been around for over 300 million years. The fossil record indicates that there was a giant 6-foot-long salamander called Ichthyostega that wandered Greenland. Back then, Greenland was a much different place. But the fossil evidence states that amphibians have been around for a very, very long time. And amphibians are... Did I lose it? Fortunately, my clicker here. Oh, there we go. So, a little slow on the battery. Anyway, amphibians, they go through this process called metamorphosis. And when we think of metamorphosis, we might think about how a butterfly becomes or starts life as a caterpillar. Well, amphibians go through the same process as well. But they're the only vertebrate or animals with a backbone that go through this process. And that makes them unique in that sense. The only vertebrate that goes through metamorphosis. And I forgot to state this. So I'm from California. I live in Oakland, California, in the Bay Area, near the Central Valley. And I worked with this species quite a bit, the California tiger salamander. And it's an endemic species to the area, meaning it only lives in this valley in California. And a big female tiger salamander. They're very similar to your spotted salamanders here, Ambystoma maculatum, I believe is the species name. Don't quote me on that. But Ambystoma californiense, they're about the same size. They get about 8 inches long. And big female will lay 1 or 2 eggs at a time, 800 times at the bottom of a pond. In a few weeks, we'll have a nice little egg right there, and different than reptile or bird eggs, this is actually a permeable membrane, a very jelly-like egg. Reptiles have hard-shelled eggs. And there's the embryo right in the center there. And after a few weeks, they're going to hatch out into this beautiful creature right here called a larvae, so a salamander larvae. And now that isn't really an attractive term. We think of larvae, we think of maggots or flies or something. But you know, tadpoles, polywogs, they get the cute names because they're from frogs. Salamanders, we call them larvae. But they're actually quite beautiful. These salamanders have external gills, and toads and frog tadpoles, they have internal gills, just like fish. So they start life breathing one way, and then after a few weeks to months, they're going to start to change and develop lungs and start breathing air. This is quite remarkable that they can do this. And tiger salamanders have to have these big gills because they live in very low oxygen environments. So big gills allow them to absorb more oxygen. But after a few months, their ponds are going to start to dry up, and they're going to have to crawl out of the ponds and metamorphose into these beautiful salamanders. And so you can kind of see this guy still has a tail fin, and if the photo's a little darker, you'd see it has gill buds where it had just metamorphosed. So amazing process unique to amphibians. And there's about 7,000 different types of amphibians around the planet, so the diversity is incredibly high, and most of those are frogs and toads. So there's about 6,000 frogs and toads. That's actually why we're saved the frogs, because if we were saved the salamanders, people would be like, there's not that many, so why are you trying to save them? But frogs, no, they're charismatic, and that's why we chose frogs. But we're trying to save all amphibians. But save the frogs, 6,000 of them. And then there's about 600 species of salamanders around the world. And actually, it was interesting, I was just looking up today the salamanders that you guys have in your backyard. And you actually have quite a diversity as well, including a really awesome one called the mud puppy, which is a fascinating animal that lives in the streams in Minnesota. Very, very cool type of amphibian. And the next group are the Sicilians. Has anyone heard what a Sicilian is or seen a Sicilian before? Yeah, it took me a long time too. The first time I found it was this individual here in Panama. This is a limbless amphibian. They have no arms, no legs. Most of them are blind. They only live around the equatorial region. So this one was found in Panama, but in the Congo and southeastern China. And these amphibians, they actually, they live underground. They're phosphorial, and so they rely on different senses than what other amphibians rely on. For example, right underneath their nose, they have two organs called tubercles, and I love that name, tubercle. And what they do is they actually sense vibrations of animals coming by, and so they can go and find them in a pitch dark environment. So it's an amazing adaptation for these animals. And so Sicilians actually, they range from 12 inches long to this one was about 3.5 feet long. So, and we don't know much about them. We think there's about 200 species, but there could be a lot more. So an animal that lives underground, we don't know too much about it. And then frog calls. This is probably one of the most interesting thing about amphibians is their ability to communicate with each other. And I'm curious, what's a frog sound like? Oh, that would be one. So what's another one? Usually when one starts a call, another will start the call. Any in your frog in your backyard? Any brave souls? Okay, no pressure. So the reason I asked that question, so I heard like a crick or a ribbit. So when I hear ribbit, that is a Pacific chorus frog from basically my backyard in California. And the reason the ribbit is the most common frog call when people think of a frog is because all Hollywood movies and shot in LA, if there is a frog, that's the frog that's in behind the studios and they record it. So that is a very famous call. But I asked that question because there is no frog here that might, actually there is a Western chorus frog, which does kind of sound like that ribbit here. But if we were to go to Ghana, and I would ask kids there, what does a frog sound like? And they'd say, quack, 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 because their most common frog there is an African bullfrog. It's this giant frog with a loud, loud call. If we went to Panama, and I asked kids there, what's a frog sound like? They go, because that's a tungura frog, another frog that calls there. There's 6,000 different types of frogs on the planet. Every single one has its own unique call because you don't want to sound like the other frog at the pond. And why do frogs call? Well, pretty simple, trying to get a nice date. So it's the male frogs that are calling, they're trying to attract a mate, and the best frog, or the best boy, gets, or the best call gets the girl. So, really unique among amphibians, this amazing call. Very, very cool thing. And where do amphibians live? Most amphibian diversity is in the tropical rainforest. This is a Maya mountain frog that's only found in the country of Belize. And like it and many others, it lives mostly in the rainforest. Brazil has the highest diversity of amphibians on the planet with about 900 species. The Philippines has 300 species. I counted Minnesota's amphibian diversity, and I think it was somewhere between around 15 species. California only has 30 types of frogs. So the further away you get from the equator, the less diversity because of the harshness of the environment. In a tropical rainforest, it's hot, it's humid, it's wet. There's lots of water. Amphibians love water. But if we come back to my backyard, this is in a place called Livermore, which is not very far from where I live in California. Doesn't look like a very frog-friendly place. This is in the middle of June, and this is cattle grassland, actually. And this grassland, the Central Valley of California used to be a giant pond. It was a delta, a stream of vernal pools, wetlands, but now it's been restricted by agriculture and urban development. And so amphibians have to survive in some tough places. And this cow pond right here, we're all standing by it. We've been in and out of it all day. About 100 cows visit it every single day. It's not a very fun place to do field work, but it's just chock full of salamanders. And so, but there were also red-legged frogs, western toads, and Pacific chorus frogs. And the reason they're all there is because they have to adapt to these harsh environments. And so amphibians are quite incredible. There's frogs that live in the Sahara Desert, the Mojave Desert, in some of the driest, hottest places on the planet. And they've evolved over time to live in these harsh environments. They're resilient species. But what's happening to the frogs? And so if you may have noticed Save the Frogs, there's obviously something I want you guys to know about. And the punchline here is that, well, 2,000 amphibians are threatened with extinction. So there's 7,000 on the planet, and about 1/3 of them are threatened or declining in population around the world. And not many people know that. But even more alarming is that since 1979, scientists have recorded over 200 species that have gone extinct. Now, this rate of extinction is not normal, and scientists compare that to that of the dinosaurs going extinct. So very, very important to understand. And we've lost some amazing frogs. And if anyone's been to Costa Rica or they've heard about frog declines, they might have learned about this frog right here called the golden toad. It was famous because, one, it's an absolutely beautiful amphibian. It's celebrated in Mayan culture. And in a period of about 10 years, it was wiped off the map. It just suddenly disappeared. They normally would gather at these high mountain streams and breeding congregations of thousands. Then the next year it would be hundreds, and then it was a few dozen, and then there was none over a period of a few years. Mysteriously vanished. An uncommon one is a frog from Australia called the northern gastric brooding frog. Has anyone heard about this frog? No one. All right. Well, this frog made headlines earlier this year for one reason, but we'll get into that in a second. But this frog is incredible for the way that it took care of its young. A pregnant or a gravid gastric brooding frog, it would lay its eggs and then turn around and swallow them whole. Now, the stomach is the most inhospitable place on the planet for any species. But what this frog could do, it would turn off its digestive system, it would fast, and there's no stomach acid, no digestion at all. And its stomach would actually kind of be like a womb, very similar to how placental mammals take care of their young. And when those frogs, they develop into tadpoles, and grow up into little frogs, and then when they get too big, they cough them up. It's a whole other expression, like having a frog in your throat, right? Okay, a few chuckles, that was bad. Okay, the point is though, that is an amazing way to take care of your young, because you don't have to hide your eggs, you don't have to guard your eggs, you can take your babies wherever you are, and as long as you survive, your offspring is the best chance of survival. And there were only 2 species in the world in Australia that did this, and they both went extinct in the 1980s. And there's nothing like that. And the reason I said you might have heard about it is because recently some scientists actually cloned this animal and kind of have brought it back to extinction, which is highly controversial and it raises all these questions. But fascinating nonetheless. And the number one reason this is happening is habitat destruction. And this is similar to all species on the planet. They're losing their homes. Where people go, typically the wildlife, the environment tends to degrade. For example, this is an illegal gold mine in Ghana. And this is at the Atiwa Forest, and out here is a very biodiverse area of southeastern Ghana, and this obviously does not bode well for amphibians or any other form of life. So habitat destruction, big threat to amphibians. And then infectious disease. The golden toad and the gastric brooding frog both suffered from the chytrid fungus, like these frogs as well, which is a worldwide fungus that's been spread by people, actually accidentally. We didn't know this. And so the frogs in Costa Rica were going extinct because this fungus was moving down through Latin America, and eventually by 2006 and 2008 it had reached Panama. Now scientists, they were so lucky though, because they're like, okay, all the frogs are going extinct in Costa Rica, the frogs are going extinct here, let's go and try and collect as many as possible and bring them into captivity. And they did. And so when they did that, you know, like this frog here, the Panamanian golden frog, this is an animal that's extinct in the wild, but we have now successfully taken it into captivity, and where it lives has this fungus all throughout the ecosystem. And so this frog probably will not be able to be returned to the wild, but at least we have it in captivity. Unfortunately, when you have an X amount of individuals that are the last known of their species, and then you have a funny looking one like this that's not doing well, this is a big problem, because amphibian biology is a very new science, and disease ecology is very new with amphibians as well. And we have not identified all the threats that are facing these amphibians, like these diseases. And so it's a big concern when we have these new these species that are only so many left in captivity and they're dying. So diseases are a big threat to amphibians. And pesticides and pollution is another huge threat to amphibians, because amphibians, they're very special in the way that they act like a little sponge. And there's actually a joke about frogs. There's a great comic by Calvin Hobbes, A Kid and His Tiger, and there's a comic where he's talking there's a frog in the pond, and he's like, well, you know, catch it. It's like, no, frogs sit in water all day so they can just pee on you. Well, it's kind of true. They sit in water and they soak up this water into their body, and because that helps them stay hydrated, because they can actually breathe through their skin, they can drink through their skin, but they can also absorb toxins and chemicals in their skin as well. And so if there's an area where amphibians live that's inundated with these pesticides or fertilizers, it gets absorbed right into their skin, and we can see some alarming effects from that. And so like this is a frog found not too far from where I live in California. California is either the 8th or the 7th largest economy in the world, and most of that's from our agriculture. We produce a lot of agriculture in our state, but Minnesota's the same as well, especially being close to the Corn Belt. So we can see these effects when amphibians live in these areas where high pesticide and fertilizer use has come, and you have these deformities. I've even learned, someone told me at the community college here that in their suburban neighborhood they have ponds nearby, and they're finding frogs with deformities. Well, just what we use on our lawns and what we put down the toilet can even run off into streams and wetlands. And the frogs are telling us, they're bioindicators, they're telling us that something's wrong with the environment. So, big threat to amphibians. And climate change and global warming is also going to be a very big threat, and it is actually a threat now, but it's going to keep persisting to be a threat. For example, in Yellowstone National Park, all the high mountain lakes, about 1/3 of these high mountain lakes and ponds are drying up or are dry. And so species like the boreal chorus frog that depends on these high mountain lakes, they're running out of habitat. But this is a salamander that only lives in this one area of Guatemala, called Biotope de Quetzal, and it's this one mountain. And basically, it lives at the top of this mountain. It likes cloud forests. And if it gets warmer, the salamander is going to have to keep crawling higher and higher up the mountain until eventually it runs out of cold area to live in, higher up the mountain. So, big threat to amphibians is climate change as well. And then over-harvesting for the pet and food trade is a big issue. I actually started kind of my interest in amphibians in a different way because I kept them as pets. I kept reptiles and amphibians as pets. And those feelings have changed, but that was kind of what